Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I am joined once again by my good friend, Dr. Philip Chase. Hello, Philip.
Hello, AP. It is such a pleasure to be here, and I am very excited to be talking more Toll the Hounds with you. We have some great topics in store, don't we?
Yeah, and this is the thing. We started out, we did one spoiler chat, for my channel. We did the non-spoiler for your channel, and then just as we've gone on, and the books have become not necessarily that they have become more complex, but because so many things are now coming together and building up in them, that we're seeing the fruition of a lot of things that were laid on and laid out early in the series. And so that naturally means as we get towards the end, that there's more and more to talk about. And let's face it, these are chunky books.
They are chunky. They are
I,
weighty books, weighty books.
I know there's this, some people say, oh, but you should trim everything away. You go, but think of how many hours entertainment you got reading Toll the Hounds for the
Yeah.
same price that you would have gotten a much slimmer book. I go, this is value for money right here, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes, indeed. And as big as they are, I regard them as being very what's the right word here? I mean, there's no fluff here. Okay, there's a lot of beautiful development of theme, and that's where you realize, okay, this story over here is actually really relevant to this story over here, and that there are all these wonderful thematic links and plot links often too that you find out about. Oh, okay, now I understand how this is related to that and all of that. But there's no wasted space here. There's no wasted space.
And again, that is something that with a retrospective on the series and with this reread that we are doing,
Yeah.
you actually get a much better understanding and comprehension of why these things are not wasted space. That on a first read, you can miss what the context is because you don't have the full context until you finish the series. And it's only with that sort of retrospective look or on doing a reread that you go, oh, I get the relevance of this now. And that is something that is kind of awe-inspiring in some respects, that someone sat down, constructed a 10-book series where all of these things were very deliberately placed so that they would play off. Doesn't mean that every single thing pays off in this particular series. There are links to ANC Esselmont's work. There's stuff that comes from Esselmont's work into the Malazan Book of the Fallen. It's a two-way street in a world built by both these gentlemen. So this is a spoiler talk. So before we get started, just as a warning, it is a spoiler talk about Toll the Hounds. We are going to make reference to earlier books in the series, but we are not going to be making reference to anything further on. Just to be clear, because I don't want people shouting at me for this particular thing. They shout at me for other things, fine. But I want to make sure that everyone is aware of the sort of the spoiler policy. So what I thought we would talk about today is Anomander Rake. So this character is one of the most recognizable characters with the Malazan Book of the Fallen. It's one of the a lot of the fan artwork, he's immediately recognizable. And,
iconic, I think is the word, right?
And I do recall a certain video by an acquaintance of ours, the High Fist himself, Ruthen Bad, in which he disparaged the good Lord Anomander Rake. And at the time, I had offered, for a lot of new readers, I had done a perspective on Anomander's character and located it just for Gardens of the Moon, and how the complexity of Rake's character, actually, a lot of it comes across in Gardens of the Moon, even though it's not fully developed and filled in for the reader. But now we're at a position where I think we can have a slightly more detailed rebuttal of
a full defense. A full defense. And I don't know what it would be in lawyer terms. You would know that better than I, but yeah.
Hopefully an ass kicking.
Nice.
But in all seriousness, Ruthen had a really good video about this, and he was speaking very articulately, very intelligently, and had some really good analysis. And I know we just presented that It's a bit of fun. I have a lot of respect for Ruth and Bad, and
As we all do. Yes.
and it's, you know, you say these things in videos, and some people take it not necessarily in the spirit in which is intended. But Ruthen was quite critical of some aspects of Rake's character, and I think Toll the Hounds and some of the information we've picked up from the earlier books really deals with what happens when we have a character that is viewed externally, both the reader perspective of a character who they're not getting a detailed point of view from, and characters within the novel, how they perceive the character. And I think this is actually an aspect that runs through Toll the Hounds. And a lot of it is very well illustrated by the character of Anomander Rake, and also the character of Nimander and what Nimander goes through. And I hopefully we will get on to that and how that relates to the Rake discussion. But starting off with Anomander Rake, Philip, what are your initial sort of thoughts on this?
So Anomander Rake in the context of Toll the Hounds, and maybe this is the most important book in the entire 10-book series to understand Anomander Rake's character. I believe that that's probably a safe claim. And we have various perspectives of him. And as Erikson has done so well in the past, giving us in Gardens of the Moon the perspective of Baruch, for example, on Anomander. Giving us the perspective later on of Whiskey Jack on Anomander. In this book, we have several characters such as the priest Endus Silon. We have the high priestess. We have other characters. You mentioned Nimander. We have characters like Clip, even, who has an idea, sort of similar to Ruth and Bad. Clip has an idea about Anomander Rake that might not be entirely accurate, that might leave out certain aspects of his character. So I think that you have to put all of these perspectives together, and you also need to take into account what we learn about Anomander Rake here, what we learn about his motivations, what we learn about the room within which, and it's a very tight space, the room within which he has to negotiate. We learn a lot about Dragnipur and the realm within it, and what Anomander Rake is trying to do with that. And we learn a lot about his relationship with Mother Dark and the consequences of the ancient falling out of the Tais Andi with Mother Dark, and her absence, and what that has meant, and the burden that has put on Anomander Rake. Because when you talk about Anomander Rake, I think that it's very important. Dragnipur literalizes this into a metaphor, but it's about the burdens that he's carrying and the sacrifices that he makes. So all of these are aspects that come together in Toll the Hounds to give us, I think, the fullest picture ever of this incredible character.
Because I think when we approach Rake in this, like, this is the first time there's been a real detailed sort of look at him. Because if we think in Gardens of the Moon, he's introduced as the Dark Lord of Moonspawn, the Chaos Main. He's this figure standing way up on a floating mountain, raining mage energies, mage fire, and the release of all of this magical power down on an army. He's demanding the heads of these mages who had betrayed him. He is leading an army against the Malazans, and of course, because of the narrative perspective, we're rather fond of the Malazans,
right?
And he's not really setting himself up in the best possible light. But even in Gardens of the Moon, we see that he travels and speaks to Baruch, the High Alchemist, and he sends Crone first to ask Baruch's permission. And I think this is the first sort of clue, because we're going to see, I'm going to try and build up to this, but that's the first clue. He sends Crone to ask Baruch's permission to arrive. And when he arrives in Baruch's chamber, it is weighed down by not only his own personal power, but what he is carrying. Yeah. And when he speaks to Baruch, he speaks to him as an equal. He doesn't talk down to him. He isn't haughty. He isn't, oh, I'm a deep emo edgelord. I believe might have been one of Ruthen's expressions. And you can understand why, from a reader perspective, when you're reading into this, you go, oh, he's the Dark Lord and he has like a really cool sword and he has all of this power. And oh, you know, he's he's so sad and dealing with his emotions that it superficially you can get that gloss from the character because you're looking at those initial signals and not necessarily thinking through the ramifications of what we're seeing on the page. And when you hear about Mother Dark turning away, it's, oh, he lost his mommy. You know, no, but think of that in terms of the spiritual connection. Imagine that you actually had direct communication with your deity, and then one day they stopped talking to you. And what that does in terms of your soul, your spirituality, like you've lost this connection to the divine, how crushing that must be. And we also like he can turn into a dragon, he is soul taken, but over the course of the books we've seen how becoming soul taken changed the people who did it, who drank the blood of Tyam, or however it's phrased in the books, that they became draconic, they became in some respects reptilian, or well, draconic is probably more accurate, but it changed them. And it has taken time for Rake to recover an element of humanity, because we saw in those prologues how cold he was. And that contrasts with the friendship we saw develop between him and Whiskey Jack, that he recognized someone, admittedly a human, whose life was going to be over in an instant to him. He is so long lived, but he still recognized someone who their spirit shone through who they were. And this was a kindred spirit, even though it was going to be very short-lived. It was still something to be savored in the day. And that tells you again something about Rake. He doesn't dismiss people because, oh well, they'll be dead soon. He lives, he tries to live for the day. And that doesn't sound like an emo edgelord to me. Admittedly, my command of the modern lexicon is a little shaky, so maybe I've misinterpreted it. But there's someone who is trying to embrace carpe diem, who is trying to see the best in the situation, which doesn't seem to gel with that. And when he tries to intervene with the Tenaskari so that Whiskey Jack doesn't have to kill them, Whiskey Jack obviously misunderstands, but we see that he was trying to save someone else's pain.
Right.
And again, it wasn't doing it to show off. He wasn't doing it to be cruel. He wasn't doing it he was trying to do it to save someone else. And again, that's a level of altruism that speaks about his generosity of character. So before I carry on to Toll the Hounds, now that I've been talking forever, do you want to start adding anything into this so people don't accuse me of just ignoring you?
Oh, well, just actually one little thing, and it's something I think that you have talked about before, but it's worth mentioning here. And that is, you mentioned how when in the prologues and in earlier versions of Anomander Rake, when he has just emerged from this draconic period of his, he has a much colder aspect to him. And I think it's an interesting contrast if you look at his brother, Silkus Ruin, who is basically being, trapped by the Azath. At the moment when he had just emerged from this experience, he remains in this more draconic sort of mindset. And it explains the difference between the two. One of the biggest differences is that Silkus Ruin still has that very cold, calculating, draconic mentality, whereas Anomander Rake, as you said, has had hundreds of thousands of years in which to get in touch with his humanity, and he seems at the time of the Malazan Book of Fallen to have really changed, who have evolved in those years, whereas his brother hasn't had the chance to do that because he's been trapped in the Azath. So interesting contrast there. But let's get on to Toll the Hounds, because there are so many threads here, I think, that we need to raise in order to give us the full picture.
Okay, so I think a good place to start is to think of some of these external perspectives of Rake and how other characters view him. And how Rake's actions don't necessarily line up with how they perceive him. And I think the one that you mentioned earlier that I think is a great example, because it's sort of almost a contrast and counterexample, is Clip. Clip's internal monologue does not reflect an accurate picture of Anomander Rake, because Clip has him cast very much in this vein of the Black Winged Lord, and he has a very negative, pejorative, and fixed view of who Rake is, even though he has never met him.
Right. Right.
So what do you think of Clip's view of Rake?
Well, Clip is, you know, he's a character that very few people would claim to love, and because of,
Well,
I mean,
apart from
I think
himself, like
apart from
he
himself,
definitely loves Clip.
yeah, Clip loves Clip. But I think when people use the word emo, that Clip probably fits it way more than Anomander Rake does. But at any rate, he is understandably distraught, though, at the demise of his people. Now, they are a kind of, I guess, offshoot of the Taist Andi. They have Taist Andi blood in them, but they have been, you know, they've been isolated, and there may have been some admixture through the centuries and centuries of their existence, so that there are there's a sense in which Clip's people not only are isolated, but having been broken off from the rest of the Taist Andi, may be seen as lesser, okay, and then the main group that's with Anomander Rake. So they're somehow they're the hillbilly relatives way off in you know, in the middle of nowhere. So there could be a sense of inferiority coming from Clip as a result of that, but also just anger because his people were wiped out. And where was Anomander Rake? Why wasn't he helping? We've been neglected for all these centuries. We've been forgotten. So that anger is not entirely unjustified, is it? From his perspective, he doesn't know what Anomander Rake has been doing all this time. He doesn't know what he's been facing. So there is that.
And one of the, again, this is one of the powers of narrative perspective. From Clip's perspective, he has a genuine grievance against Rake. Where were you? Why were we left behind? Why did you never come for us? Why did you never interact with us? Why did you never come and get us and bring us up on Moonspawn? And from Clip's perspective, and if we buy into Clip's perspective, you go, actually, that seems like a very genuine grievance. And you go, any of you pick up the phone on your end to ring him? Phones work both ways. Yeah. And obviously not phones, but why did they never travel to Moonspawn? Why did they never contact Anomander Rake? Why did they never travel to Warrens to find him? It's always, well, why didn't Rake come for us? You know, were your legs broken? Like, couldn't you walk? And it's the pushing of the situation onto the other party to create a victim, and to say, I'm the victim of this, and therefore you have to make recompense. And it pushes the blame onto someone else and makes you blameless. And I think we can all see that in our own lives, where, you know, we sometimes frame things in certain ways when we're having arguments to push the blame onto the other person and make ourselves perfectly innocent. Because it's nicer being the innocent party, and it's not nice having to admit when you're wrong. Mm-hmm. And I think this shows an element of Clip's stunted growth and maturity in terms of both intellect and emotion and empathy. And I think that's a big thing.
He can egocentrism, really. Yeah.
And he is fixated on the self. Yeah. And even in his attitude, and we spoke about this in the other spoiler discussion, that even if it's he's trying to convince himself he doesn't care about other people, because otherwise then he has to admit that he does, then he'll have to feel it, and that can be overwhelming. That this is perhaps a self-defense mechanism, and that's one way to explain it. Or it could be that he is genuinely just that sort of egocentric, and he cannot empathize, he cannot see outside of himself, and to try and imagine himself in someone else's shoes. Even his attitude about Dragnapur, where he thinks of it as just a weapon, as a powerful weapon that can be wielded. But the reader knows that that's not what Dragnapur is. Yes, Dragnapur is a powerful weapon, but think of that scene where for a moment Rake puts it aside and the stone starts to sweat, and you realize how much of a burden this is. This is not, I want the coolest, most powerful weapon and this is really awesome. This is a curse.
Right.
And if he gives it up, someone else has to carry that burden. And what I mentioned earlier about his altruism that, people tend to overlook. Would he give someone else that pain? Would he push that burden on someone else? No. Does he reveal to anyone else what that burden is actually like? And you go, it's only Endest Salan. The others don't see the burden of Dragnapur. He always controls it when he is with them. But it's Endest Salan is the one that sees how much of a burden this is to Rake.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about Endest in a bit, but first I think it might be interesting to compare and contrast, unless you want to do Nimander later, but Nimander and his party, in contrast to Clip, they also feel abandoned, but they aren't as sure. What we have with Clip is he's damn sure of himself. His perspective is the only right perspective, whereas what you see in Nimander and his party is a lot of doubt. So we can go back to them, but I just wanted to make that one point of contrast because they are all sort of thinking, have we been abandoned? And there's some bitterness in Anomander's party as well. So,
and I think you're exactly, well, let's deal with this now because it is,
okay.
Why have Clip and Nimander's party travel together? And for precisely this reason, it's showing two halves of the same coin. Right. Nimander and these children and the get of Rake being raised by his brother.
Yeah.
And they go, well, why did Andrus take us off to this island? Why weren't we being raised by Rake? And it's like, well, Rake wasn't necessarily the best parent in the world. And
absent father, yeah.
And that is a criticism of him. He wasn't a great dad. He had difficulty showing how much he loved his children. He didn't have that relationship.
I'm not entirely sure though how literal we need to be about Anomander Rake being the actual father of all of these people, because it seems among the Teist Endi, particularly that Mother Dar, for example, is Rake literally the son of Mother? I don't think so. Are Nimander and his friends, because there's such a they sometimes Fade was his sister, sometimes his, they seem to not really care about these labels too much.
And when you think of how complex family trees are in various mythologies, right. Mother, sister, daughter, aunt, it all gets a bit, and referring to Rake as father, I think it could possibly be very true in some specific instances, say for instance Nimander, whose name
Nimander,
whose name bears a striking resemblance to Anomander and Anderist, that there's a link there. But for a lot of the others, then maybe it is an honorific that he is the paterfamilias, the head of the family, and therefore the father figure. And and he's not a particularly good father figure for any of them, be they his biological children or grandchildren or great grandchildren or whatever relation. But the weird thing is, both Clip and the others come across very much, and you think they're kind of like teenagers. Until you realize they're hundreds of years old.
Right.
And you then put it in the context of, yes, but Anomander's over 300,000 years old. So yeah, it's a drop in the ocean if they're 1,000 years old.
Right.
But what we see with Nimander, in contrast to Clip, is he doesn't have that surety because he is trying to imagine it from a different perspective. And he doesn't believe that his view is the only view. He doesn't believe that his view is absolutely true, absolutely pure, and no other view can can exist. He is unsure. And we get a lot of his internal thoughts about this. But
Exactly.
what we see from everyone else is they trust in Nimander implicitly, explicitly, and without reservation. They trust Nimander. He is their leader, and they will follow him. And it almost creates in us as readers, why are they following Nimander? He seems racked with doubts.
Right.
And they say, but that's because he's considering different points of view. But when he decides to act, he is decisive. When he makes that commitment, nothing will stop him.
Right.
And that's, I think, what we see. And when we take that and we map it onto Anomander,
Exactly.
we're suddenly getting a lot of what Nimander is, who he is, how he thinks. This, I think, is a very good facsimile for what is going on in Anomander's mind that we do not see.
Right. So in terms of Nimander's doubt about whether he is worth following, whereas we see in the reflected faces of the people following him that they are devoted to him. And as you say, I think what we can do, because the apple hasn't fallen that far from the tree in this case, is we can attribute that same, even though we don't get it as because we're not in Anomander's head the way we are in Nimander's head. But I think a reasonable conclusion would be, wow, wait, so Anomander also has been racked by these doubts over the years, and this sense of not being worthy of the devotion given to him, which would explain a lot of his actions, would explain a lot of the way he interacts with the people who are basically worshiping him, and he doesn't want to be worshipped, right? He wants to be an equal to the people who seem so devoted to him and see him as divine, essentially. But he has the same doubt that Nimander has.
And one of the reasons I think we can justify making this almost direct mapping is when we look at who Anomander is and how few of his original followers are left, how few of the original Teist who were his supporters and his friends, how few of them are left. And we see what happens on Nimander's journey, that they start as a larger crew and slowly over time, he loses people until it is just the core left. And we see that with Anomander. We see what happens to a lot of Anomanders. And it's even remarked on that there are so few of them left who were originally with him.
Right.
But I think that gives us that additional linkage to show why Nimander is so much a reflection of who Anomander is. And we're to use that as a key to understand Anomander's mind.
Yeah, it's wonderful. And also the way that the other members of Nimander's party relate to him. And they see him very differently from the way he sees himself. That's made so clear. And then you realize that you can apply that to Anomander, and it changes everything. It really does.
And the thing is, that technique, Erikson has used that before a couple of times. Think of how Breeze Bedict constantly doubted himself all the way through Midnight Tides. And yet, when we see him in action, you go, this is why everyone is scared of him. But he, all the way through that book, doubted himself. He was like, oh, but that other person must be good. That other person is very good. I don't think I'm as good as... And he doubted himself. And it wasn't that he didn't have faith in his own abilities.
Right.
But he didn't think that he was absolutely awesome and all-powerful and amazing and everyone should bow down. Unlike, is it Geron Eberic, the other swordsman?
Yeah. Well, this is why Clip is such a great foil to Nimander, because Clip is very sure of himself, right? And his abilities, and he fails. Whereas Nimander is way more riddled with doubt, but he has a lot more integrity. He has a lot more solidity than Clip. So.
And again, we see it with Endest Salan. Endest, who believes that he is broken, that he has no more strength, that he has nothing more to give. And we realize he was the one that held Moonspawn together under the ocean.
Right.
He did it.
And
on his own.
he holds off the dying god at the end too. You know.
And then when he has nothing, oh, I can't, I'm poor, I'm weak, my knees are frail, my nose is knackered. You know that scene from The Life of Brian.
Mm.
Oh, I'm just an old man. And he's lost faith in himself. But Anomander looks at him and goes, no, you, I believe in you. And it's not, I'm going to use you up. It's Anomander has absolute faith in those around him. He can see their worth and their strength. And he celebrates that. And he trusts them. And
I think he does, though. He does understand. He believes in them and he trusts them. True. I think he does understand on some level that he might be using up Endless Salon and at this sort of end of times gamble of his.
yeah,
But that the sacrifice is worth it. But here's the thing: the sacrifice of Endless Salon and of his other follow, like Spinnik Durov, I think this has a far greater impact on him than his own sacrifice. So that he knows what he's doing. He's using his people in order to achieve a much bigger thing, a much greater goal. And so he is making this, in a way, the sacrifice of the people he cares about is a greater sacrifice to him than his own sacrifice. Does that make sense? Because it hurts him more.
and what I find now, people may disagree with me on this, and that's perfectly fine. But my reading of when he basically tasks Endist and when he tasks Spinnock
Yeah,
is he's asking. He isn't ordering.
right.
And when they kind of put up objections, he's like, but I need you to do this.
Right.
But he doesn't say, you must go and these are my orders, go forth and do it. I have given you order. He doesn't order them that way. He places his faith and trust in them. They feel bound by that. But
He gives them an
ultimately,
out. He gives them an out too. He says, "Look, if you think you can't, I understand." Right? But they such is their devotion to him that they want to do this for him. Right?
and that I think to inspire that level of devotion,
Hmm.
they must see something in him. And if you think he's been leading them for 300,000 years and they are still around, that when the entire race is infected with ennui, when they are trying to find anything to keep their spark alive because their divine spark has turned its back on them.
Yeah.
And he has devoted his life to this. He has devoted his entire existence to this.
Yeah.
He is carrying this sword that, yes, he took from Draconis, killed Draconis with it, and we find out that spite was involved in that, and that's obviously a fun story that we'd love to get the ins and outs of. But we see they are devoted to him, but he still asks. He makes a request, and he lets them know how important it is. But he leaves it up to them. Whereas you get it, if it had been Clip would have said, I am your lord, I am your master, go and do this thing.
Right.
What we see with Nimander is, again, he doesn't want to order in the same way that Rake doesn't want to order. And he knows the sacrifice that his followers are going to have to make. And he treats that as a burden because he is willing to sacrifice himself.
Yep.
But he doesn't want to sacrifice his friends. And I think we can all understand that if it was a choice between, do I push someone else under the bus or do I push them out of the way of the bus and let the bus hit me? You like to feel that you would be the one saving other people.
Right.
And here we see that. And that's, again, going to altruism and going to trust and going to respect. Rake respects other people.
Yes.
And we see that in the moment when he goes to see the high priestess in her own office, in her own environs. He doesn't summon her to his room. He doesn't summon her to the throne room as the lord and master of the Teast. He goes to her and politely sits down in the chair and leaves the better chair for her to sit in because it's her room. He is a guest in her office.
Right.
And again, it's like sending Crone to speak to Baruch. This speaks volumes about character, respect for other people. Yes, he is far more powerful than her. Yes, he is the Lord of Moonspawn. Yes, he could order her around.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't, because he respects her, he respects her position, he respects other people. And that, I think, is such a key trait to Rake that is so important to understanding his character.
Absolutely. And the other character, I think that in similar way to Endus Salon, where we see this dynamic of the respect that the follower has for the leader, but also the affection that they have for one another, and the the respect goes both ways. You know, Rake respects the follower as well, and loves the follower. And this is, of course, Spinach Durov, right? There's the other relationship where we see this dynamic at play. And he does a similar thing with Spinach. In a sense, he knows that Spinach has, you know, fallen in love, and he knows that he has his own private life and his own, perhaps, I don't know about aspirations at this point, but being a Teist ND, you don't tend to have a lot of aspirations usually.
Well, Spinach Darav is really the Murillo of the Teist.
Yeah. I mean, for a Teist ND, he's actually fairly cheerful. Yeah. So, but anyway, he understands this, and so he knows what he's asking of Spinach, and that when he has asked him to go off and do this thing, which is essentially to oppose Kalor, and he knows that Kalor is capable of killing Spinach Durov, and that this is a sacrifice being made. It's a very similar dynamic, I think, between Anomander and Endus that you have here with Anomander and Spinach, right?
And again, he makes a request and he gives him an out, and he says, like, I understand if you don't want to, you have other things, I will find another way. I was counting on you, but I can work around that. I can do something else. He acknowledges that Spinach maybe didn't want to do this or can't do it. And while Spinach has reservations because he has fallen in love with a mortal woman, and he also has his friend, the Seer Doman. He's worried about what's happening with Seer Doman and the Redeemer camp. Spinach has these other concerns. But when it comes down to it, he's like, but how can I let Rake down?
Right.
And you see his willingness to sacrifice his life. He sees that as his duty. But Rake, again, doesn't manipulate Spinach. He doesn't force Spinach. He asks of him as a friend, as an equal, can you do this? And again, I think I keep coming back to this, that this is, for me, one of the core characteristics of Rake that is not often spoken about, because he has a cool sword, and he turns into a cool dragon, and he's really powerful, and he's also tall, and his hair is by Timotei. And you know, he has all of these sort of tropes that we see about the Dark Lord or the Elf Lord and all of these sorts of things.
Yeah.
And sometimes we forget to look past the superficiality of that and actually look at their actions. And when we don't have a detailed character point of view, it can be much more difficult to see the characterization. But Erikson has been doing this throughout the books, this indirect characterization. Think of how other people perceive them. Look at their actions and weigh their actions.
Right.
And again, there's room for different interpretations. I'm not saying that we're right. I'm just saying that Ruth and Bad is wrong. And
there's one other character whose relationship with Rake is pretty important, although a bit more mysterious than these others, because we never quite get in her head, and that is Silana, right? And to win the devotion of an Elaine like that, you got to be somebody special, right?
But also, and in reference to that, and spite, or sorry, envy, Lady Envy.
Yeah.
So there are two of Rake's bows knocking around in this book, and I cannot imagine them being so different, like, any more different than they actually are, because Solana we get is this motionless, fearsome,
Yeah.
portent of destruction, where she is hanging over the city literally as a threat, but never moving. And the humans seem to regard her almost as a statue. And yet, Spinnock is like, they have no idea. If they knew what Solana can be like, they'd be petrified and running. And then we see Lady Envy, and we see the conflagration the fight that she has with Spite, and the levels of power there. That these are women, female characters. Solana is a female character, maybe not necessarily woman, but female character. And they must see something in Rake, and it's not just his devilish good looks and very good hair.
Yeah.
And it's his power, his quality, his strength. But it's his strength of character, his strength of will, but also I think a lot of it is his respect for other people. Yeah. The fact that he cares for other people. He doesn't want to use his power. He doesn't want to abuse his power. And that level of restraint, when you consider how powerful he is, what he could do, he could be a tyrant on the level of race.
Oh yeah.
He could be the ruler of entire continents, because who could oppose him? And we see, how do we get that sort of perspective? We see Kalor again as almost this mirror of who Rake is. We see who Rake is by seeing the other people to contrast him with.
Yeah, but I'll tell you the most telling moment in Toll the Hounds for me, in terms of Rake's character, if you want to know what he's all about, is when he first sends Hood into Dragnapur with a message to Draconis to ask for forgiveness. And Draconis is shocked by this. And of course, when Anomander Rake himself comes into making this sacrifice, and poor Dassam, who is sort of, I think, plays a role in this as well. That is, he's kind of set up as a pawn in this, I guess, if you will. But Rake makes this sacrifice because he knows what's at stake. But he had sent Hood first to ask for forgiveness from Draconis, who then responds with, forgiveness? I'm the one who needs to beg for forgiveness from you, right? The fact that he would make that gesture, I think, should tell you a lot about the character, right?
And you know, to build on that, a character who is not willing to ask a sacrifice of his followers that he is not willing to make himself. Precisely. Because when it comes down to it, Rake has asked them to do things, but what he has asked of himself is so much more. Because if his plan works, Spinnock Durav may die, Endus Solan may die, they all may die, and will be embraced by Mother Dark. Yeah. But if his plan works,
not him,
he doesn't get embraced by Mother Dark.
Right.
And again, he doesn't brag about this. He doesn't sit in a corner weeping, going, oh, woe is me, this is a terrible fate. He's like, no, this is the right thing to do. I cannot ask my followers to do anything that I would not do, and I cannot ask anyone else to make this sacrifice. So I will make it. And as you said, he asks forgiveness of Draconis.
Yeah.
And you know, when I see that level of depth of character, and none of it is done through a long, extensive POV chapter from Rake's perspective where he's thinking about it and he's telling the reader all about it.
Right.
And yet we've sat here discussing this, and I think even if you disagree with a couple of the points or a couple of the interpretations, it's a pretty persuasive argument from what is in the text that this is actually a fairly accurate reading of Rake.
Right.
And you can understand why he is such a popular character. We can see that superficial level of why he is popular because of all of the cool aspects, the good hair, that chiseled jaw, the high cheekbones, and his mighty sword.
Don't forget the tweed. He does wear tweed, I'm pretty sure.
Maybe tweed undergarments, although I assume those would be itchy. But we can see all of those aspects of that sort of cool aspect of Anomander Rake, and we can dismiss that, and go, that's all it is. Or we can look at these deeper aspects and see him as not a paragon of virtue. Rake has his flaws. His flaws are readily explored multiple times and referred to. He's never presented as without flaw, and yet he is always presented as trying to do the right thing. But we've seen he has a temper. We've seen that he does things, that he makes mistakes and is not perfect, but he tries. And then we see from all of these other characters, these elements of who Rake is. And we understand the depth of this character. So I think Rake is one of those characters in the books that shows how well Erikson can create characterization without a POV chapter, without long detailed exposition or internal thoughts from a character, that you can get an incredibly complex picture of someone from these external elements, from these thematic connections, from all of these different perspectives, and from their actions and words and deeds.
Yeah, it's amazing. And how he is not only remedying mistakes that he might have made in the past, but the mistakes of others, like Draconis,
and Mother Dark.
And Mother Dark. Yep. And Mother Dark. Yep. So
but I think we've finally done a little bit of justice to Rake's character, the much maligned character of Anomander Rake. And I just wanted to thank you for joining me on this, Philip.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and I know that we're going to please some people. Counselor Moonspawn, for example, I hope she'll appreciate our efforts here, and I'm sure many others. Rox, I think, is a Rake fan, and so many of our other viewers. There might be a dissenting voice out there. There might be a dissenting voice or two with the initials RB, perhaps.
Who knows?
Or
sorry, Hood knows. Yeah, that's much better. But thank you very much for joining me on this, Philip. It has been an absolute pleasure. And for those of you still watching, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support. I hope you enjoyed this, and we will see you in the next one.